My name is Ann Boylan. I serve on the Delaware Humanities Council, a group of about 24 Delawareans, many of whom are here tonight. We all have these little name tags. Can't hear? Better? Better? All right, thank you. We all serve on the Delaware Humanities Council, which is a group of about 24 of us. We're all committed to bringing significant and transformative humanities programs to all parts of our state. We believe, as you see from the sign, that the humanities can engage, educate, and inspire, and bring people together for serious conversations on important topics. I chair the program committee, which, in conjunction with our energetic program officer, Sierra Fisher, our new executive director, Michelle Stein, and the council as a whole, as well as our wonderful staff, plan the annual Joseph Del Tufo lecture. I should point out that in our audience tonight is Dr. Tess Del Tufo. Thank you, Tess. It was her late husband, Dr. Joseph Del Tufo, who played a crucial role in the formation of Delaware Humanities these many years ago. I am serving tonight as a substitute. Michelle Stein, our new executive director, is unfortunately dealing with a serious family emergency. Her dear father died last night. Michelle had hoped to be here very much in order to greet you all and to meet so many people who support Delaware Humanities. But I probably should also mention that in the audience is Marilyn Whittington. Where are you, Marilyn? There she is. Marilyn was the executive director of Delaware Humanities for, I think, about 150 years. Am I right, Marilyn? And she has just retired, and I don't know what it is, but somehow, as a retiree, she looks about 20 years younger. What is it? Thank you for coming. As many of you know, Delaware Humanities is an affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which has, since the mid-1960s, been bringing humanities programming to every corner of the United States and its territories. Tonight's program is part of a larger NEH initiative entitled Democracy and the Informed Citizen. And in conjunction with that initiative, Delaware Humanities is sponsoring a 10-episode podcast series entitled A Matter of Facts, in partnership with Delaware Public Media. And you can listen to those podcasts on WMPH 91.7 Wilmington and WWDE 91.1 Dover. And because we know you can't get enough of tonight's speaker, you can go to our website, dehumanities.org, click on the podcast for September 21st, which features Steve Coll. Mr. Coll has also graciously agreed to take some questions after his lecture and to sign copies of his books, which the UD bookstore is providing for us in the hallway. For the question period, to facilitate discussion, we ask that you please use the blank card in your program to write down your question clearly and succinctly, emphasis on clearly. Ushers will collect the cards, and then we will be able to use them to facilitate discussion at the end of the lecture. We are greatly indebted to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for the podcast initiative and the Pulitzer Prizes for their partnership with Delaware Humanities. We are also indebted to one of our own sterling journalists, Mark Bowden, who will introduce Steve Coll. Mark is currently national correspondent for The Atlantic, but in his earlier days, he wore out a lot of shoe leather and burned up landlines, before cell phones, as a staff writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer. More recently, he has gained fame for his books, including Black Hawk Down, which I imagine many of you have read and or seen as a film, and most recently still, his book, Hue, 1968, which is, I understand, soon to be a television series. Mark Bowden.
I'm going to read you some words from a famous newspaper columnist who wrote, "The thing we are all up against is propaganda. Sometimes I think that this age is going to be called the age of propaganda, an unprecedented rise of propaganda. Propaganda as a weapon, propaganda as a technique, propaganda as a fine art, and propaganda as a form of government. The columnist who wrote that was Dorothy Thompson, and she was writing those words in the 1930s, primarily about Nazi Germany's spinmeister, Joseph Goebbels, working his dark magic over Europe. The antidote, Thompson wrote, was for Western journalists to represent a theory of journalism, a theory of what journalism stands for, a thesis of journalism, a philosophy of journalism in countries where this philosophy is fundamentally repudiated. Today we can add the United States of America to the list of those where journalism is being fundamentally repudiated. One of the sad things I've realized after a lifetime in the profession is that most people actually prefer propaganda. We enjoy being told that we're right and that what we already believe is true. So there's never been a better time to hear from a real reporter, not the kind that covers the world from his upstairs bedroom in his pajamas. Steve Coll's last two books, Ghost Wars and Directorate S, offer a fascinating and definitive account of America's long entanglement in Afghanistan, from the covert role that helped bring us Al-Qaeda and 9/11 to the ongoing and failing slog of our war in that country. A staff writer for The New Yorker, a former international reporter for The Washington Post, author of 8 books, winner of 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and dean of the Columbia School of Journalism, Steve is one of the great journalists of my generation. And he embodies the difference between real reporting and 99% of what you read online or in social media, most of which is not reported but repeated. I used to tell my journalism students at UD that the work starts when you get out of your chair. The real work of journalism is not a matter of reacting in 140 characters or less to something glimpsed on TV or social media. It demands research, travel, and listening to actual human beings, preferably face-to-face. In the case of reporters like Steve, it means cultivating over a career the relationships and trust that persuade knowledgeable people, who often have good reasons not to speak their minds, to do so. It requires the ability not just to listen, but to ask good questions, and then to shape that material into a story. There's never been a time when honest, independent journalism has been more important to our country and the world. Steve not only practices it, he's working to educate the next generation. So I'm eager to hear what he has to say. I give you Steve Coll.
Thank you, Mark, so much. It's an honor to be introduced by one of the great journalists of my generation, someone I've admired and really tried to learn from as a reader for a long time. And thank you, Delaware Humanities, for having me down here. I always like to speak to a crowd that's had a few drinks before they sit down, especially when I'm talking about something uncontroversial like journalism. But I'm looking forward to the discussion, and what I'll do is talk for about 40 minutes or so, taking my watch off, make sure I don't go over. And then I look forward to what you are interested in. Please feel free to ask about anything beyond the scope of this talk. What I want to talk about with my time are a few things. First, how serious should we judge the threats to journalism and the First Amendment in the country right now to be? What is the nature of those threats? What does this fake news slogan that the president is very proud to have invented really mean? What are, besides propaganda, what is the structure of this propaganda and misinformation that's polluting our democracy? How did we become so polarized about the function of journalism? And Mark touched on this. What does good journalism look like anymore? and how do we try to press that kind of journalism into the future. So I want to start with a story that's related to the school that I work at. I've been there now, this is my 6th year, which is the story of Joseph Pulitzer, who founded Columbia Journalism as well as the Pulitzer Prizes. And the theme of this story is that journalism has never really been uncontroversial or stable or particularly erudite. And his life story exemplifies that, although it takes us to a kind of inspiring place. So I don't know how many of you know anything about him, but Joseph Pulitzer was actually born in Hungary to a very unfortunate family. His parents died and all of his brothers died before he was 20. And he came of age in the middle of the American Civil War. And you'll recall, in the last years of the war, we had a draft on the northern side of the war. And it was quite an unpopular draft. And one of the ways Lincoln got around that was that he allowed those drafted to hire a substitute if they could afford one. And so a lot of wealthy families, especially in the Hudson Valley of New York, would place ads in European newspapers saying, would you like to come be a mercenary in the Civil War? And this kind of orphan Joseph Pulitzer answered one of those ads. He came to the United States. He only spoke German. He was inducted into a German-only speaking cavalry unit. And in 1864-65, the last year of the war, he rode up and down the Shenandoah Valley with these German-speaking comrades. Didn't see much action. And then the war was over. And he mustered out. And now he was an American, still didn't speak much more than German. He knew that there was a big German-speaking community in St. Louis, so he went west. And when he arrived, he became interested in politics and journalism. And in the 19th century, really throughout the 19th century, journalism was almost entirely related to political competition, to partisan competition. Newspapers were the explicit arms of one party or one faction or another, and they did battle with one another, sometimes through investigative reporting, sometimes through just publishing harsh opinions about opposing candidates. And St. Louis was a very complicated place because it had been a border state, and there was still some residual violence in Missouri after the war. And so Pulitzer became a Democrat, which was the party associated with the opposition to Reconstruction, opposition to the 14th and 15th Amendments. But it was a very local and very vicious competition between the Democrats and the Republicans. And he started publishing newspapers in German. And he became an investigative reporter, but an investigative reporter in the sense of modern opposition political research. Whoever was running against their party, he would look into their business affairs and publish investigations about them. So one day, as he was developing this career, he published an investigative report about one of his Republican opponents. The guy objected to it, came to Pulitzer's office the next morning. They got into a very heated argument. Pulitzer pulled out a gun and shot him. So now he didn't kill him, he wounded him. It was a case that kind of trailed him around later in his career. So I try to tell my students, when you think of the Pulitzer Prizes, think of, the Nobel Peace Prize was endowed by someone who invented dynamite too. And so this has not been always the most elevated of professions. And so Pulitzer was a very ambitious and entrepreneurial and insightful publisher. He learned English, eventually moved to New York, and became the publisher of the biggest newspaper for immigrants in New York, the New York World, which made him his fortune at the turn of the century. It was a paper for immigrants. Its innovations were comics and color illustrations. But toward the end of his life, he suffered, he became blind, he lived in a lot of pain, and he became very reflective about the future of journalism. And he started to imagine a profession that was quite different from the one that he had grown up in, one that would think of itself as a profession, an independent profession, comparable to law or medicine or accounting. And the whole idea of professions was rising at this time in kind of American society. And he wrote in 1904 in the North American Review, which with The Atlantic at that time was one of America's great thought magazines and one source of great influence, what turned out to be an incredibly far-sighted essay about the future of journalism as a profession. It was an argument, essentially, that journalism should pull itself out of the gutter, put its guns in the drawer, and start to think about itself as a servant of democracy, a servant of an educated citizenry, a source of accountability for people with power, for politicians, for businesses, but accountable also as a profession to its own high standards. And in the essay, so he defined a version of journalism. You go back and read this essay, it's easy to find online. It's remarkably farsightful, way ahead of his time. And he built the school around that idea, and he endowed the prizes to model the kinds of excellence that he had in mind. And in his essay, for some reason, he chose, it was 1904, and he chose 1974 as this faraway future that he couldn't quite imagine. And he kept asking, what would the United States be like in 1974, and would its democracy be accountable to the people, and would journalism have risen to the challenge of being a profession? He wrote, "Shall we preserve the government of the Constitution, the equality of all citizens before the law, and the purity of justice, or shall we hand the government to either money or the mob?" Okay, 1974. You're all nodding. You get it, right? A couple of Washington Post reporters have something to do with the resignation of Richard Nixon. And one of them, Bob Woodward, was an exemplar of the very professionalism, the high levels of training. A Yale graduate, had been in Navy intelligence, was a beat reporter in the suburbs before he got onto the Metro desk. And the way he saw his function, the way his newsroom saw his function, was exactly what Pulitzer had envisioned. So why does this feel like it's going away? Why does it feel like it's under such pressure, such threat? The era of professional journalism that Mark and I grew up in, and we were chatting before, I'm glad to absorb something I didn't quite understand, how full his career in the newsroom of the Philadelphia Inquirer of a certain era, the Gene Roberts era, one of the great professional newsrooms that the country has ever had. I grew up in the same era at the Post, kind of post-Watergate, drawn to the profession precisely because of people like Woodward. And yet now that feels like it's crumbling, not just economically, but culturally and socially in a lot of ways. So how did we get here? So I want to give you a quick, short, but I hope helpful history, because I think it's important to understand the structure of the problems that we're in now. It's not just that we are in a divisive period of populism and polarization politically. There have been a number of structural shifts that have exacerbated the weakening of this professional vision of journalism that Pulitzer enunciated. So let's go back to the 19th century. Remember, newspapers in those days were just instruments of political competition. It was not uncommon in the 19th century not only for someone to go argue about an investigative report and get shot, but it was not uncommon for a mob to wake up on one side of a political argument, object to what was in the morning newspaper, go to the newspaper office. If they were polite, ask the reporters and editors to go outside and then burn the building down, smash the presses. I mean, it was a violent and competitive profession. It slowly yielded to Pulitzer's vision, partly because of technology and partly because of this self-consciousness about professionalism that grew up in the 20th century, and partly because of some economics that I want to quickly describe. So the first voice in professional journalism that sounded like it was interested in the facts more than political argument was born from the Telegraph, and it was the Associated Press, which started partly because of the need to be very concise on the telegraph wire, but mostly because all of its clients were at war with one another, and it wanted everybody to be the AP's clients about what happened yesterday, what ships came into harbor, what stocks were sold at what price. And so they adopted a tone of professional neutrality in order to avoid the very kind of polarization that they were born amidst. And that voicing followed journalism into the 20th century. And to skip over some chapters, but to get to the world we grew up in, because I think all of you, many of you, other than the university students, you probably grew up and then during your working lives, you had a newspaper land in your driveway every morning, and it was a way you engaged with the world, both locally and internationally, the way you informed yourself as a citizen, the way you framed the questions you wanted to see political office holders answer. Now, that era of newspapering was also influenced by something like the forces that shaped the AP's voice. The business model of newspapers, when the Philadelphia Inquirer was at its peak and the Washington Post was at its peak, was based on the ability to reach as many households in a given metropolitan area as it was possible to reach. The newspaper had to be welcome at many and diverse breakfast tables. And these were highly educated readers. They were looking for a rich and diverse file. The newspaper was everything to everyone. It had a crossword puzzle. It had news from abroad. It had news from around the corner. But it had to be welcome in as many households as possible. And so I think in the newsrooms, we all had a sense that it was our obligation to report and write in a transparent way, in a fair way, in a way that would be recognized as inclusive of different points of view. And this was all part of the franchise, to be really welcome in so many homes every morning. And think about what was happening in television in the same period. We only had 3 major broadcast networks. They were licensed because the spectrum was scarce and valuable. The Federal Communication Commission required them, in exchange for this valuable, scarce spectrum property, to operate in the public interest, to justify their renewals for licenses by pointing to things they did that served the citizenry. And they would often point to their news divisions as evidence that they were willing to lose money on faraway television coverage in order to meet their public interest obligations. We had something called the Fairness Doctrine that was about access to the airwaves in political competition. Now, those structures of regulation, politics, and economics, they have been obliterated very quickly since the 1980s. We've gone through wave after wave of deregulation, some of it rationalized around technological change. We don't need these public interest obligations anymore because everything has opened up. The spectrum is available to anyone who wants to start a website. And the economics of newspapers obviously have been decimated by the digital disruption. The result has been fragmentation and deregulation. Now everyone can be a publisher. We went from a cable world of maybe 30 channels when we were all first getting our cable subscriptions in the 1980s to however many you can count today, 2,000 if you still have a cable subscription. And what is the problem when you have such a fragmented universe? How do you distinguish yourself in amidst such noise and chaos? Of course, the answer is emotional engagement. In order to have a successful news business these days, you need people to emotionally engage with your content. And what has been the strategy that we've seen publishers and broadcasters pursue in many cases, especially on cable? It's tribalization of audience. It's what Marx said. You just want to tell people what they already believe because we are human beings. We have what evolutionary biologists have demonstrated as a cognitive bias. We have something that triggers an emotional response when we receive information that confirms our beliefs, that creates a sense of solidarity with people, like-minded people. And now you look at two channels like Fox News and MSNBC. Maybe they don't deserve to be equated as two sides of the same coin, but they are both examples of this kind of strategy. Now, both are enormously profitable. Fox is insanely profitable. And a lot of the profits come from the strange economics of cable where they get a piece of everybody's subscription. But the main reason Fox is so powerful is because its audience is so emotional about the centrality, the essential importance of Fox News, that if a cable operator were ever to pull it off the system or to deprive its viewers of access to Fox, they know that they would have a riot, that they would have people protesting and lots of trouble on their hands. And in newspaper publishing and in digital publishing, something similar is starting to happen. You see that the only way newspaper-based organizations are going to survive economically in the landscape we're in right now is to get people to pay for subscriptions. People have been very reluctant to pay for news during the digital era. Now, the sense of charging people is associated with their being engaged, being part of a community of membership, a community of like-minded people. Now, that like-mindedness may be around the pursuit of hard-hitting, truthful, fact-based reported journalism, as at the New York Times, but there are a lot of people who would look at the community that the New York Times is building around its subscriptions and say, well, there's an emotional component there too. There's an opponent of identity, of tribalization. We are all on the same team here, and it may be about our cultural preferences as well as our political ones. Two more things, I think, have shaped this world that really troubles us today. One is that it's not just the fragmentation of media that has led to this tribalization. We're all doing it. There's a great book that's now a decade or more old called The Big Sort that is by a sociologist and a journalist. And it describes how Americans over the last 30 years have increasingly sorted themselves physically into like-minded communities. They want to live next to people who think the way they do, who see the world the way they do. And the headline evidence of this is that since the 1970s, the number of so-called landslide counties in the United States, meaning counties where one presidential candidate or the other wins by more than 20 points every time, has something like tripled. And you can, I'm sure, see this in your own worlds of how people are sorting themselves, whether it's gated communities or whether it's communities around shared evangelical convictions, or whether it's communities around shared convictions about liberalism and coffee. You know, this is not just the media creating these tribes. It is the media reflecting what we have sorted ourselves into over the last 20 years. And then add to that the last huge disruption, and this is really the story of journalism, publishing, and distribution over the last 6 or 7 years, which is the rise of social media platforms. Primarily Facebook, but also YouTube and Snap and now Instagram and others. The consequence of these platforms has been several-fold from the perspective of journalism. One is that newspaper publishers, serious newsrooms, whether they're based in legacy newspaper franchises like local newspapers, or the Philadelphia Inquirer, or the New York Times, they've lost control of their distribution. You basically cannot operate a digital publishing news business, even if you're Fox or CNN, without sending your work across these platforms, these social platforms. That's where the audience is. You need the scale in order to survive, and so you reluctantly let go of your own headlines at the end of your newsroom, and off they go across Facebook to be shared by the rules of some algorithm that is completely opaque and unavailable to you. And when you find out that some customer of Facebook has received your New York Times headline alongside a piece of pure propaganda that was associated with a content farm in Eastern Central Europe, and then alongside some extremist content because of that algorithm, you don't even know it's happening, never mind have the opportunity to intervene against it. And look what a disruption that is for the ecosystem of really strong, fact-based reported journalism. You know, in the day, not that long ago, in our professional lifetime, at the Inquirer or at the Washington Post, we controlled the distribution of our news, the framing of our news, all the way down to your driveway, right? So we had the newsroom, we had the systems, we had the printing presses. It was our ink, they were our trucks, they were our contracted paper boys at the end of the route. And if you were like me, you'd go out into the community at the Washington Post and to an event like this, and you'd say, what's on your mind? And all they would say is, why do you keep throwing the newspaper in the bushes? You know, we were accountable for our distribution. I mean, we were accountable for our distribution. And that was the whole structure of the news system that we operated in. Well, now publishers, the Times is an exception. They've tried to build a proprietary site based on high-priced subscriptions. But almost everyone else has no choice but to let go of their material down these social media platforms. And what are those platforms? They are polluted. They are polluted sewers, really, we discovered in 2016. In the case of fake news, let's get to that phrase now. Of course, I think we all understand that President Hu is he's an experienced reality TV performer, and he loves experienced reality TV performer. He had a show on the air for 10 years. So he... Okay. Anyway, so he... Okay. For the sake of everyone else, we'll save the questions for the question time. When he refers to fake news, in my judgment, he's just talking about professional reporting that he doesn't like. But there is fake news on social media, and it is genuinely invented. Some of the investigations about the origins of these made-up stories that are distributed in very large numbers across social media platforms, of course, have traced the origins of some of this work to foreign governments, Russia in the case of the indictments that were brought by the FBI recently. But what's so fascinating about this misinformation, this literally fake news, invented headlines, is that some of it is commercially manufactured offshore for profit. There was an investigative reporter who's been working on this named Craig Silverman for the last few years, and he traced a whole batch of fake Hillary Trump headlines to a village in Macedonia where a very clever math teacher had gotten his high school students to create a kind of a content farm where they would write invented stories about the 2016 election, about the most emotive issues, send them across Facebook. They would get clicks, and then they would get ad revenue off of programmatic ads from these invented stories. They ended up writing a lot of incendiary anti-Hillary, pro-Trump headlines, but the reason was just that those were the headlines that people clicked on, and they made lots of money. And it was extraordinary. They made tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars. There are people doing this all around the world trying to figure out how to game these systems. The most shocking thing about the revelations about the pollution on Facebook in 2016 was that Facebook had no idea, claimed to have no idea about the scale of what was going on. It took independent researchers operating without Facebook's cooperation in many cases to pull down the data to demonstrate that these fake stories, whether they were of Russian origin or of commercial origin or extremist groups of different kinds, had been shared millions and millions of times in contrast to Facebook's claims. Facebook didn't even acknowledge the scale of the pollution on the platform until almost a year after the election had been decided. And of course, as you can see now, if you're following this at all, these platforms have a huge reputational crisis. They're worried about being regulated. They're worried about losing their audience. We do see evidence in the polling that consumers who used to trust news that was shared to them on Facebook have lost some confidence in the platforms as a source of information. But by and large, these companies are built on a model of being a neutral platform. Their whole business depends on their denying their responsibility as curators or as editors of news and stories. They've built themselves up as a very powerful public square in our society, but they are adamant that they are not media companies that should be judged responsible for the content that flows across their platforms the way, say, television networks or newspapers might have been accountable for their content. So that's, I think, the structure of this problem that we have. All of those changes, all of those disruptions, finishing now with this public square that is privately controlled by duopolies and where the operators of the square themselves are not even able to count and make available to the public what is flowing across their platform. So what is the journalism that we should honor, that we should strengthen? What is the journalism that you as citizens now have to teach yourself in a new way to recognize as reliable? We're in a new age of media literacy. Not everyone is going to be able to watch what gets shared across their Facebook platform and identify the truly manufactured and invented stories from the real ones. Everyone's going to have their diet of their favorite media brands. If I asked you, what do you rely on, you probably would tell me today, if you're like most Americans, that you pick and choose a few more news sources than you used to. You don't rely on one. But the problem of truly invented propaganda that is distributed for malign purposes, whether by extremists or foreign governments or commercial mischief makers, is not going away. It's going to intensify. With artificial intelligence, it's going to be harder and harder to distinguish what is real and what is manufactured. Even the big brands like Fox or CNN or New York Times now are being exploited by very sophisticated artificial intelligence programs that create logos that look like the authentic logos, but are not. They have just slight variations. And the ability to do this more and more on these platforms is accelerating. At the end of the day, you're going to have to identify news organizations that are grounded in reporting. If you want the kind of journalism that we all grew up in, if you want the kind of journalism that Pulitzer was talking about in 1904 and that was relevant to the resolution of a constitutional crisis in 1974, you're going to have to find news organizations that are reporting in depth and with vigor and with honesty, and they're still out there. That work is what has endured across lots of eras of technological change. It is harder to fund it. We have responses growing up that are very positive, nonprofit newsrooms that are making a contribution to public interest reporting. I think as a citizen, and I don't say this self-interestedly on behalf of journalists, you're going to have to consider paying for news that you believe in, for reporting that you believe in. You paid for it before in different ways, and we're going to have to kind of convert ourselves back to an engagement with the actual costs of doing this work. It does require travel. It does require research. You do have to file Freedom of Information Act requests and sort through the data. And then you have to go and knock on doors and ask questions about how power is being allocated and used. And this kind of reporting also is going to have to be resourced for the age of these big platforms and these invisible algorithms and the bots and the computation that's necessary. You know, a lot of us, I tell our students, a lot of us got into journalism because we really didn't want to do math. I mean, it's a pretty good escape from computation. It used to be. Not anymore. I mean, what is the function of journalism? It's to hold powerful institutions and individuals accountable, to hold them transparent before the public. We live now in an era where power is exercised by algorithms. It determines what prices you see when you go shopping online based on your zip code and your past conduct. Increasingly, it allocates public resources. Policing resources in communities like this one are being allocated on the basis of predictive models that are rooted in computer science assumptions, and the engineers who are writing these programs have almost certainly not had ethical training or thought about the unintended consequences of their outcomes. They're engineers. They're just trying to write the perfect diagram. And we're seeing more and more instances of algorithms that are unintentionally, at least in their composition, creating very profound biases and distortions in the way resources are allocated. Journalists have got to learn to ask hard questions about those kinds of sources of power as much as they do about presidents and governors. So let me finish by addressing the question of how serious are the threats to the press that we face today. And, I think it's important to apply the principles of reporting and independence and sobriety to assessing the threats and the rhetoric that are around us that we want to bring to all of our work. I'm quite fond of a phrase that Marty Barron, who's the very able editor of the Washington Post, uses when he talks to his reporters about how to deal with their jobs, their function, in the age of President Trump's attacks on the enemies of the people and much other populist rhetoric that seeks to delegitimize the professional function of journalism. What he says is, we're not at war, we're at work. We have a constitutionally protected function. It's protected under state law. It's a profession. We have a business that is independent and determined. We have a newsroom that is full of talent and persistence. Let's just go do our jobs. Now, the question is it going to be more and more difficult, more and more dangerous, less and less privileged to do the work of constitutionally protected journalism in this country over the next 5 or 10 years? I think it's useful to break down the threats into a few categories. So the First Amendment protections for the working press that we grew up with, that our lawyers told us about when we went out to knock on doors and to write tough stories, those are relatively recent in American First Amendment jurisprudence. There really wasn't a First Amendment press law until the 1920s, and a lot of it was bad when it first sprung into being. The modern protections that we enjoy under the First Amendment, constitutional protections, really date to the 1960s. The Sullivan standard for libel, which is the most permissive in the world. If I write about a public figure, I have a lot of space to be tough on them, as long as I work honestly. And of course, the Pentagon Papers, which establish the principle that it's only in the very, very rarest of circumstances that the government can intervene to prevent something from being published. They may seek a remedy after it's published, but they can't preempt it. So those are the two most important constitutional protections that journalists enjoy, and I don't think that either of them is in imminent danger. You do have this consensus, left-right consensus on the Supreme Court about the First Amendment. The two sides have very different views of what they want the First Amendment to protect and where they want it to go, but they generally have strengthened it. Now, that's the only good news that I can offer. In addition to these First Amendment constitutional protections, working journalists depend on the laws in 46 of our 50 states that offer qualified privileges to journalists to protect confidential sources, to avoid being dragged into courts, to the kinds of qualified protections that psychiatrists have in certain circumstances. They're not absolute. They vary from state to state. New York has a great one. In this atmosphere of seeking to delegitimize journalism, of populist rhetoric, the attacks on journalists as enemies of the people, rounding them up in cages at rallies and airplane hangars and using them as props for populist outrage against elites and against political opponents, that political atmosphere that has girded these state laws, I think, is weakening. And I won't be surprised if over the next 5 or 10 years, because I don't expect this mood in the country to go away very quickly, I wouldn't be surprised if those state laws start to be rewritten in some parts of the country. And then you have direct violence. We have to remember, and I'm sure many of you understand, that the populism that President Trump used to bring himself to office in this country was part of a worldwide phenomenon that well predated his own campaign. And attacks by authoritarian governments and crime syndicates and collaborations between governments and crime syndicates on journalists have been intensifying over the last 5 years or so. You know, deaths of journalists in the field go up and down when wars go up and down, but the number of murders that have gone unsolved, direct assassinations of journalists, has been the most disturbing feature of the worldwide press scene over the last 3 to 5 years. We can talk about the Jamal Khashoggi case if you like when we get to questions. But I think Mark would know, as anyone who's worked in these countries does, that it's very unusual when there's an authoritarian leader or a populist leader who singles out any vulnerable group, any specific group, a minority group or a group that's marginalized in some way or another, or that's unpopular in some way or another, and then calls for attacks on them. It's very rare that attacks don't follow. So the more this rhetoric persists, the number of threats, online threats, physical threats, offline threats that working journalists face today in the major newsrooms that are highly visible, orders of magnitude greater than anything we knew 20 or 30 years ago. Now, you can say some of this is just social media noise, and mercifully, other than the horrifying incident in Annapolis earlier this year, we haven't seen this environment turn into physical threats. But my experience is that's just the way it rolls, especially if the rhetoric is sustained and the attacks are kind of violent in their language over a period of years. And yet, at the end of all of this, I think that the attacks on the press that we have seen over the last 2 to 3 years have actually strengthened the press in many important ways. You see, I saw this at Columbia. When I first got up there 5 or 6 years ago, it was understandable that young people often seemed a little confused about what journalism was anymore. Aren't we all journalists? I'm carrying around Instagram and telling stories to my friends. Does that make me a storyteller? Once in a while, the most disheartening version of this would be I'd have a young student say, with a donor who had given a scholarship that the student benefited from, and the donor would say, why did you decide to come to Columbia? Why do you want to be a journalist? And the student would say, because I wanted to tell my story. And I would think, unless you swam here from Guyana, I'm not really interested in your story. We're here to tell other people's stories, to document the stories of people who are not heard, to ask questions about power and its exercise, and to uncover what's hidden. And what's been so helpful at the school, and you can see it in every newsroom, is that the atmosphere of the last 3 or 4 years has really clarified for a lot of people what it's all about. Let's go to work. Yeah, I know what this is. And at the core of that is the reporting function. And think of the reporting that journalists, professional journalists, despite the economic pressures, despite the shrinking newspaper newsrooms, despite the polarization and the tribalization, the contributions that they've made over the last year or two alone. This monster Dr. Nasser at USA Gymnastics. The Indianapolis Star is a newspaper that has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. Now, those women that started to come forward, that started to put the first evidence on the record about this heinous cover-up and the long years that it occurred in, they were working with trusted local journalists at a newspaper they had been reading since they were, since they'd lived in the area. It's very hard to do that kind of investigative reporting if you don't know the journalist, if you don't know the institution, if you don't have a sense of its professionalism, the fact that it has an address in the community, that the reporters have an address, that their kids are also at school and in church, and you know where they live. The whole Me Too movement, Harvey Weinstein, all of the reporting about abuses of power in the media, in Hollywood, in lots of institutions, none of that would have unfolded the way it has if it weren't for hardworking journalists working in a very difficult environment, willing to verify, willing to report, find multiple sources, get people on the record, give them the assurances that they required to speak on the record. And then traditional government reporting, too. Yes, the press has really struggled with how to cover Donald Trump, and we can talk about that in questions. But they have also done what reporters do when an administration is undisciplined, when cabinet secretaries abuse their offices. Remember that secretary, I think, of Health and Human Services who resigned because he was flying around in private planes to have lunch with relatives? That was a story that was done the old-fashioned way. The reporters went out to Dulles Airport. They kept asking questions. What planes are you flying on? They were shut down. Nobody would talk to them. They started writing down the tail numbers. They started following the money. They started following the trails. And they put enough on the record to force a resignation. The fellow who resigned at EPA for building up all these security apparatus and spending all this money, despite being very much aligned ideologically with the president, he was forced to resign because journalists showed that he was abusing the public trust in the way that he was spending money in his office. And we're only at the beginning of what I think journalism will contribute to the remainder of this administration. So we are at work, and it's important work, and it needs an educated and media literate and paying citizenry to do its job. Thanks for listening. Happy to take your questions.
The first question is about local media, local newspapers. A lot of what you talked about addressed the national, the big metropolitan and national newspapers. What's your prescription for small town or medium-sized town newspapers like Wilmington, Delaware?
Well, we have a crisis. It's the most important crisis in journalism, with the loss of locally owned, locally operated professional news organizations that have the reporters to do the work that communities need to inform themselves, whether it's about politics or land use or the quality of the school system or all of the things that shape life in a local community. And that this is we have news deserts opening up around the country where local newspapers have failed and or are shrinking to the vanishing point, and where nothing has risen up to replace them. There are experiments in nonprofit journalism at the local level that have merit. There are NPR stations that are trying to convert themselves into local news sources, but it's an epidemic, and I think we ought to be very concerned about it as a profession. From our school's perspective, this is a big priority to see if we can figure out a way to contribute, because if we were a school of public health, we would say, this is an epidemic that is of real importance to the country. One thing you see when local news goes away, civic participation declines. This is social science research that shows the correlation, and you can imagine qualitatively why that is. We need a new generation of locally rooted news publishers to rise up, and the formats are going to be different. The newspaper is, for our generation, we'll read it for as long as we can see, but young people are not going to be reading it in the same format. So someone has got to come in and create that same vibrant engagement with local news through these other formats. And so there are some green shoots. People paying for subscriptions is one of them, though it's early days. But I think essentially it's a very important and discouraging picture. The news business has migrated to the two coasts. It's become very much connected with New York and California, and it was one of the reasons, I think, why a lot of news organizations missed the 2016 election. 20 years ago, the Milwaukee Sentinel-Journal and the Inquirer and a lot of papers in the counties and in the communities that decided the election would have had highly experienced professional journalists on the ground reporting these stories out, where the mood of the electorate, the issues that mattered, not just for their own papers, but for wires. This stuff would have found its way into the pages of the Washington, would have been a tip sheet for coastal newspapers, and it was instead a lot of parachute reporting from the two coasts, and it's very difficult to understand the complexity of an election like that one if you're only visiting for a week or 2 weeks.
There are several questions about coverage of President Trump, and so I'm going to kind of paraphrase them. What is the problem with the media's coverage of him, and what are the effects of the media's fascination with reporting on him as it does?
Well, he's an attention magnet, and he has successfully made himself his own voicing, his own provocations, the center of national news attention. And he draws off a lot of reporting resources and editorial resources because he's so effective at controlling the news cycle and creating distractions and pivoting from one controversy to another just by speaking in ways that are outside of traditional norms. And many newsrooms, I think, have really struggled to figure out what to do about that. They have not, in my judgment, overall been very successful. Obviously, what the president says is news and should be covered. But what you see in too many cases is that the number of reporters and the amount of time and attention that is paid to assessing or talking about his provocative statements is way out of proportion with their durability or the importance of other stories that are not being covered. And you cannot help but acknowledge that certainly on cable, a lot of that has a commercial basis. I mean, as he knows, he drives ratings, and it's a competitive business and profitable business. And those news networks like CNN that used to be driven by reporters in the field and still have big digital reporting operations that are meaningful. They've gone to these panels of just people yelling back and forth about the latest tweet. Personally, I can't understand how anyone can watch it without jumping out of a window, but apparently it's attractive to a significant number of people, a profitable number of people.
All right, here's a follow-up, and I'm going to read this one verbatim. Why should we trust your observations when you exhibit bias against the president and fail to acknowledge the errors of the press in believing the lies of the intelligence services and the Hillary campaign in alleging collusion with the Russians?
Well, you don't. I'm not asking you to trust me as a reporter. I am aware that I object to the president's attacks on the profession of journalism. I object to the president's declaration that journalists are enemies of the people. I am defending our profession and our constitutional rights against an assault in rhetoric and sometimes in policy about access and breaking of norms that is out of line with my sense of what American political and constitutional traditions require. That is not to say that I'm up here to run down everything that President Trump has ever said or thought about international policy or domestic policy or tax policy. I'm here speaking as the Dean of Columbia Journalism School, and I'm standing up for the profession that my school represents.
So you had mentioned the apparent murder of Khashoggi. Could you talk more about that event, either as a shocking, isolated incident or as a part of a worrisome trend?
Well, it's I spent a lot of time in Saudi Arabia. I knew Jamal Khashoggi quite well, going back many years. In fact, when he came to the United States a year ago seeking voluntary exile, I met with him at Columbia to offer my assistance to him. I thought of him as a friend. I wrote one of the letters supporting his asylum application. So when he was apparently murdered in this brutal way, I was shocked. It is part of a pattern, as I alluded to when I was speaking, of murders with impunity of journalists around the world. In not every case do we know that the murder was related to the journalist's work, but in the cases where the Committee to Protect Journalists has been able to determine that that was probably the case, or certainly the case, we see dozens of these murders, very disturbing patterns like the assassination by car bomb of an investigative reporter in Malta, member of the EU, because she was working on corruption stories. We've seen attacks in Central Europe on professional journalists just doing traditional investigative reporting about corruption. Of course, in places like Mexico, there are all these invisible lines you can't cross in reporting on the cartels and on the government's collaboration with the cartels, and journalists are constantly crossing them and paying a very high price. So in that sense, Jamal's story is part of a global picture. I do think the rhetoric in this country about the delegitimization of the press may have contributed to the Crown Prince's assuming he did know that this attack was going to take place, and a lot of the circumstantial evidence that's building up suggested that he was very close to the team that went and carried it out. Why would he have thought that he could get away with it? Why did he fail to anticipate the strong reaction that has unfolded over the last couple of weeks? Well, maybe it was because he thought that President Trump or the Trump administration had already written reporters off, that they could be attacked with impunity. It is good today to see Mike Pence speaking the right words about this on behalf not just of Jamal Khashoggi, but on behalf of a free press and also a global free press. This used to be a real principle of the Republican Party, the international wing of the Republican Party, not just to defend journalists in the United States, but to defend a free press globally. And we've seen some of those internationalists on the Republican side in Congress speak out in this case, but to see the Vice President do it is certainly a step in the right direction. Just very briefly, what this is really about is the radical political changes that are underway inside the Saudi Arabia kingdom. Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince who has been associated with this event, represents a whole series of departures in the way Saudi Arabia has been governed. It was always a harsh place if you were a minority, a Shia, or a marginalized political dissident who was planning political activity. But it was generally a soft police state that ran by a lot of forms of complex consensus. And the result of getting on the wrong side of the king was what happened to Jamal. You'd lose your job for 6 months. You might have your passport taken for a year, then you'd be reappointed. It was much more of a house detention, re-education kind of authoritarian system. And this young man in a hurry, in his 30s, looks a little bit more like a Ba'ath Party dictator than a traditional Saudi royal family member.
There were many questions about social media. This one, I'm certain wasn't written by Mark Zuckerberg, but could have been. How many minds do you think social media really changes? People tend to gravitate to what they already believe, right?
It's a good question. And of course, there's a lot about the power of social media's influence on behavior and thinking and political conviction that we don't know as social science. It's too new. It hasn't really been measured. And you can see in 2016, we didn't even know what was going on, never mind what influence it might have had. But there are a few things to say that I think are grounded in solid research about the way our cognitive bias works and where our ideas of trust about information arise. So one is that in general, you tend to trust information that is shared by people you know, people part of your social network. So you're, in general, and we all have family members for whom there's an exception, but in general, when your family members and when your trusted circle, your coworkers and others share information, you say, okay, that's interesting. And a lot of political conviction arises from small social circles around the home, around the neighborhood, around the workplace. And to the extent that social media was originally an intimate space where friends shared with friends, that seemed to be part of the reason why more and more people relied on it for news and information. I just saw this. Where is it from? I don't know. My friend shared it to me. Well, who reported it? I don't know. I didn't look at that. It came from him, and he shared it with me. And so now that this problem of pollution and fakery and imitation of trusted brands and so forth has become more a subject of public awareness, I think that the power of that intimacy of the sharing is probably going to erode. But it's still the case that something more than half of Americans say they get their news from partially from social media. That's a very large population of people who are consuming news this way. And local television is still powerful, trusted. If you look at the digital consumption of news in the country, which are the organizations that attract the most reading on your phone, on your desktop, over lunch, they're the big brands. It's CNN, it's USA Today, it's New York Times, it's the Washington Post, some ABC News, Fox, some new entrants like Vox, or the Atlantic is a big player in terms of reach. And so that's good. The scale for the big trusted legacy news organizations that are for the most part doing reporting is still there. But as I mentioned, they've lost control of their distribution. So a lot of those numbers that you associated with those trusted brands arise from their being shared in these polluted environments where they're mixed up with all this junk and must create an environment that is different from the one when you really knew that this was produced by that news organization.
We have a lot of questions. I'd at least like to ask you a couple more. Is that all
yeah,
right?
Sure. I'm at your service. You guys have been very patient.
I'm just trying to aggregate a few here. Several people had questions about the New York Times and their responsibility to cover Trump and whether they should have done reporting on him and his business practices long before now.
Yeah, I mean, on Trump before now. You know, I think there were at least several failures of the big press in the run-up to the 2016 vote. One we've talked about, which was a structural problem of kind of not being prepared to do reporting on the ground in the traditional way. Another was, and I don't know how many of you got caught up in this, but there was a huge bubble in journalism in 2016 around prediction science. You know, that somehow the era of big data and computation that I've mentioned before, it's real, but that one of the implications for journalism was, well, now we can predict everything because we can aggregate all the surveys and we can predict sports results. And if you did have a digital subscription to the New York Times on your app, you know, at 6 o'clock on election night in 2016, there was a little predictometer at the very top of the page. I mean, what's that predictometer doing there? I mean, I see these in sports predictions. You know, follow a college football game. What is that telling you? Okay, Alabama's chances of winning are 95%, 95%, 95%. Oh, they've fallen behind. Now it's 3%. I mean, is that journalism? I mean, I don't even know what that. It's not. It's a trailing indicator. It's not even a prediction. You know, and so there's a lot of people who say, well, it's just because you don't understand probability. That's what the prediction science types people say. You know, 4 out of 5 means 4 out of 5, and it is true if you think about it. Like if you get up in the morning and you look at the weather forecast, and it says 80% chance of rain. So you grab your umbrella, you go out, it's cloudy, you walk around, but it never rains. You don't come home and throw your umbrella in the closet and go, oh, they're wrong. No, you know that they're wrong some of the time, you know? So 4 out of 5 means 4 out of 5. Having said that, it's not journalism. It's something else, and it should never have been so central to the file. And then I think there was a broad belief in New York, in Washington, on both coasts, that Trump was never going to win. He was never going to win. So, you know, we don't have to do the hard work of the accountability reporting and the deep digging and the full transparency. And because there was a belief that Secretary Clinton was a lock, that there was almost the reverse, which, well, we got to make sure that her candidacy is held accountable because she's going to be the next president of the United States. And that was a big fail, and I don't think that editors in newsrooms, easy for me to say because I wasn't running a newsroom, so I'm off the hook. I'm just sitting up in the ivory tower, but I don't think editors in newsrooms have really come to terms with the scale of that failure.
And a final question about being in the ivory tower at a journalism school. Several people were interested in what you tell aspiring journalists and what their future holds.
You know, it's actually a great time to be a journalist. I mean, look at what we're in. I mean, people want to come to this profession because they recognize that has been true in many previous eras. It's like Watergate. This is like the post-Watergate period for journalism. Young people are coming into the field because it's a ticket to the public square. It's a life of enormous enrichment and challenge and travel and lifelong learning. You get to stand in cages and ask impertinent questions of people. You get to live free. You know, it's a life of independence and inquiry, and it's a great privilege. And the thing that will make for a great journalism career today is the same thing that made for great journalism careers in lots of other eras of the modern professional press, which is you have to be a great reporter. You have got to learn how to report. You know, if you can report effectively, if you can discover what's not known, if you can accurately collect information on a short deadline or a medium deadline, if you can put complicated stories together, if you can clarify what's really going on, if you can carry out deep investigations into abuses of power, if you know what to do when a young woman calls you and says, I have a story to tell, but I'm afraid to tell it, and you know, I want to talk to you. If you're professionally trained to rise to that moment and to do it the right way, you will have a job. You will have a career. Reporters are not going away. The mistake that young people make is that they get caught up in, you know, ephemeral platforms and software skills and building a brand, and you know, those things may be necessary extensions from time to time of your reporting work, but journalism is reporting, and that's pretty much all we teach at Columbia. Like from the first day, go out on the street, talk to a stranger, and we try to tell people when they can still get their money back. I've been actually asked by my colleagues to deliver the Tough Love lecture in the period where refunds are still available, because we had too many students who were coming in and they would say, I don't like to talk to strangers. And so the whole purpose of my lecture was, if you don't like to talk to strangers, get your money back, go home. You know, you're going to be unhappy and we're going to be unhappy. So, and the next morning, 7 students dropped out. And like, I'm responsible for the budget. And I'm like, maybe that was a little too hard. And the faculty are like, no, you should do it that way. So anyway, I have great conviction that these jobs, this life will be there. There's a lot of disruption. As a practical matter, it's a great time to be a young journalist coming out of, you know, with good training, because everyone's hiring the next generation. I worry about, you know, paying mortgages when you're 40, but I know that the life of reporting and discovery and storytelling is going to endure.
All right.